From MTN, the Montana Television Network, this is Face the State.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us for this edition of Face the State. I'm Shannon Newth, coming to you from the studios in Great Falls at KRTV. Our topic today is human trafficking. According to the Montana Department of Justice, human trafficking is a modern-day form of slavery. It affects men, women, and children, and it subjects them to sexual exploitation or forced labor. That can take the form of prostitution, pornography, sex tourism, labor for domestic service, factory, construction work, and even migrant farming. It's actually the second largest criminal industry across the globe. We're joined today by Cascade County Sheriff Jesse Slaughter. He became sheriff this year. Prior to his current role, he was with the Great Falls Police Department. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Shannon, thank you for having me.
So you have a long history of working in what we're talking about today, human trafficking, sex trafficking. You worked with the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force when you were with GFP.
From MTN, the Montana Television Network, this is Face the State.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us for this edition of Face the State. I'm Shannon Newth, coming to you from the studios in Great Falls at KRTV. Our topic today is human trafficking. According to the Montana Department of Justice, human trafficking is a modern-day form of slavery. It affects men, women, and children, and it subjects them to sexual exploitation or forced labor. That can take the form of prostitution, pornography, sex tourism, labor for domestic service, factory, construction work, and even migrant farming. It's actually the second largest criminal industry across the globe. We're joined today by Cascade County Sheriff Jesse Slaughter. He became sheriff this year. Prior to his current role, he was with the Great Falls Police Department. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Shannon, thank you for having me.
So you have a long history of working in what we're talking about today, human trafficking, sex trafficking. You worked with the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force when you were with GFPD. Tell us a little bit about your background with ICAC and with GFPD.
Yeah, back in approximately 2011, I became interested and passionate about protecting children in our community, and basically wrote a proposal for the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, and we were awarded the grant. And then in 2012, I was selected for that position. And just in the initial stages, the Internet Crimes Against Children was a little bit more limited. Basically, the task force required that it had to have a child nexus, it had to deal with child pornography, or basically pretty much any type of victimization of a child on the internet. So it was a pretty narrow scope. And what we found when we were working the cases, we were going out in the community, we were coming across some adults that were likely being trafficked, and we didn't, when you deal with the grants and stuff, we didn't have the nexus to really make it work. We still worked the cases,
sure,
but we weren't getting the funding and support, and we saw that this is a prevalent issue, even here in Great Falls.
Right.
So a lot of the investigators, we encouraged our commanders to broaden the scope of Internet Crimes Against Children, because in the reality, we were on the front lines of it. Mm-hmm. And so it took a while, but now today, the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force does bridge the gap into human trafficking, and it works really, really well, because now when you go to rescue a victim, you don't have to sit there and worry about, is this actually a child, or is this an adult? You just move forward with the investigation. It's more seamless, so it works better.
And you were with ICAC. That was something you developed about 6.5 years?
6.5 years, that's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And now we're seeing human trafficking all across Montana. Like you mentioned, it's happening in our small communities across the state. I think for a lot of people, and even myself, when I think of human trafficking, I think of maybe in movies, you see it's in other countries, it's happening in urban areas, but it's also happening here in Montana. What blocks us, do you think, from seeing it happening in our own communities?
Well, honestly, I think first of all, there's some stereotypes to what it is. A lot of people think human trafficking is scantily clad women walking the street with people driving up in cars asking for sex, like you see on TV. And that's not the way it is. With the advent of the internet, that whole business model changed. That's obviously, the chances of getting caught are really high, and it wouldn't be tolerated. So it's more clandestine, it's more on the internet, and that's how it works. So that's probably the biggest reason. The other thing about human trafficking is we don't ask the right question. The term human trafficking can mean a lot of things. As you said in your intro, it could mean forced labor. You know, there's other things that human trafficking falls under. And oftentimes people, I think child sex slavery would be a better term, because it is, you're being forced to, you're a slave and you're being forced to conduct sex acts. You know, so I think that's a better term, but this is just the term that kind of everybody's stuck with it. And I think, honestly, we asked the wrong question. So as law enforcement and as parents and as concerned citizens, maybe we'll run into that youth that's at risk, that is a runaway, or as I prefer to call them, a missing person, or a juvenile delinquent, or an at-risk youth who is being ungovernable, you know, whatever. And we say to them, hey, have you ever been human trafficked? And the answer is almost always no. The reality of it is most children don't understand the concept of what human trafficking is, nor know the definition. The reality is we're not asking the right question. If we start asking questions such as, you know, hey, when you ran away from home and you were missing for a while, did you have to have sex with somebody for food? Did you have to have sex with somebody for shelter? Were you forced to have sex with somebody for drugs? And we seem to get a lot more affirmative responses from that. And a lot of times that's what leads us into a very lengthy, in-depth human trafficking case.
Now, do you have any examples to help people understand of cases where either you were working or that have happened, we'll say in Great Falls, because that's where we are, of these children who have been trafficked, that have been, their perpetrators have been caught in our area?
Multiple, yes. During my time as Internet Crimes Against Children detective, we worked dozens of these cases. I would love to say that they were all successful. I can tell you this, I can tell you that due to some of the stereotypes and of law enforcement ourselves and of the community, we missed a lot of them. A lot of them got missed. A lot of them were trafficked here. We had a chance to rescue them, but there was assumptions made about how it was going to work, and we were wrong, and we missed them. And that was unfortunate. The good news is we've learned a lot from that, and we try not to make those mistakes again, and we make sure we rescue these kids. You know, I can remember we rescued a 10-year-old girl who had been trafficked by her mother, of all people. Her mother was sexually abusing her, and she was trafficking her, and we were able to rescue her literally minutes before the next male was going to come to rape her. That was a huge success. We rescued a 17-year-old girl out of a local hotel here who was being trafficked by not one but two pimps. Actually, technically three, with the bottom girl that was also helping do this. And that was a very significant case. Worked another case involving a 14-year-old and a 17-year-old who were being trafficked by the same guy. And that was a pretty lengthy case. That case had an interesting success story to it. How that case started was very fascinating. It was the Juvenile Detention Center asking the right question during an intake on someone being arrested. And they asked what I talked about, the right question: were you forced to have sex for something? And during that question, during that intake session where they were interviewed, they got an affirmative answer, which then kicked off an investigation to me, which led to a successful case. But they asked the right question, you know, and Shanna Chisholm, who runs the Juvenile Detention Center, is an amazing leader, and that place is very, very, very good at protecting our children. We always think the Juvenile Detention Center is a punitive place. They do a wonderful, wonderful job of also protecting the children in our community, because they're dealing with all the at-risk youth. All these youth that are out there that are struggling and are at risk and are delinquent and are missing and running away, those are the ones who are the targets. And they do a very good job of recognizing that and alerting law enforcement.
So you mentioned one of these cases was a young woman in a hotel. And I think back over the course of us as local media covering some of the stings and things that ICAC has done, that when big events come into town, your radars go up for that. Why is that big events that come to communities often trigger these hopeful arrests of perpetrators?
So the traffickers recognize this. They go on the internet, they search up communities that they know that they've either been to or that they intend to go to with their victims, and they're going to bring them to that community to sell them for sex. So they see a big event, and that means that the hotels are going to be full, that people will be on the internet looking for people to have sex with, likely. It draws its supply and demand. There will be a bigger demand in that community this weekend. And so therefore those events draw that. So they will come to that community, they'll set up, and they'll victimize these girls and make money off of them.
So let's get a better understanding of how people get involved with human trafficking. Let's talk about the victims. How do a lot of them are adolescents? They're young adults, young men and women. How do they get into human trafficking, into sex trafficking?
So the average age in the United States in which a child gets involved in human sex slavery is 11 years old, and that's very, very young when you think about it. But they are at an age where they're basically grown up enough that they can change their appearance to make them look more adult-like, and that's important. Because the reality of it is if you enter a hotel with an 11-year-old girl who's dressed inappropriately, it's going to draw a lot of flags. But if you can use makeup and disguise and make her look older, some of these girls who are very young, some of them who are barely post-pubescent girls, they'll make them look like they're 20 years old with makeup and dress and how they make them look. So it kind of makes sense to me now that I've seen the ages, but they also they don't have the life skills. They don't have the ability to stand up for themselves. They don't have the confidence to understand the situation they get themselves in. So oftentimes, as I already said before, they're a delinquent, they run away, which I hate that term. The correct term would be they are a missing person. Let's say they're running away from sexual molestation in their own home. That's very common. Or they're running away from physical abuse or something. Or sometimes they're just running away for whatever reason. They get out, they get involved maybe with somebody, they meet somebody, maybe they get into the drug scene or whatever. They're very vulnerable. Their young age and their lack of life experience and confidence makes them an easy target, and these traffickers watch for it. One of their real common techniques is they'll go to, say, like a local shopping mall, and they'll see a group of girls. And how many people let their 11 to 14-year-old girls go to the mall together in a group? And they'll see the group of girls walk by, and they'll say hey to them. And the girl that turns and looks and responds, that's the girl he's going to go after. It's little techniques that are that simple. It's nothing, we all want to make it like it's really complex. But they offer them things. Oftentimes they'll offer to be their boyfriend. They'll take care of them. They'll give them money. They'll give them drugs. They romance them sometimes, or sometimes they coerce them. One of the big ways I saw in my work as an internet crimes against children detective was they coerce them on the internet. And how they would do that is they would use any app. Let's say it's Facebook Messenger, Snapchat, any of the common ones, TikTok, all those apps that are out there now, Instagram, you name it. And they get in a conversation with this girl. And they start telling her how pretty she is and all this stuff, and they're flattering her. And then they ask for her to take a naked picture of herself. So she sends a naked picture to the perpetrator. The perpetrator maybe sends one back, maybe doesn't really matter. Then he asks her at a later date to meet her somewhere. And there comes a point when even a young child knows, okay, wait, that's probably not a good idea. But then he tells her, if you don't come, I'm going to send this picture to your parents. If you don't come, I'm going to post this picture on the internet. And the most terrifying thing for young children is embarrassment. It is by far the most terrifying thing. And we cannot underestimate that. I think as parents sometimes we're like, knock it off. Quit getting embarrassed. But we need to recognize that's important to them. That's a big part of who children are, is building that confidence in themselves. And they get embarrassed, and so they're terrified to death of that. So they go and they meet, and then the perpetrator will rape them. And while they rape them, they take more pictures of them. And now they have more, basically, weight against them to coerce them later to do it further. And then the next time they tell them to sneak out, they're going to have them sleep with another man. And so that's just how the cycle works with a young female. And you brought up males, and I want to address that. When you're dealing with males, what often will happen is it'll be a male perpetrator, and he will contact a male online. But he'll have an undercover persona on, say, Facebook. We'll use that because it's a common one. And it'll be of a young, very good-looking woman. And he'll start talking because you don't know who's behind the computer screen.
Right.
So they'll start talking, and same thing, flatter him with, oh, you're so handsome, you're such a good-looking guy, and I'll send you a naked picture of me if you send me a naked picture of you, and they go back and forth. And then some point in the conversation, she's like, hey, would you like to meet me somewhere? The young man thinks this is great. He goes to meet her, fully knowing he's likely going to engage in sex. When he goes and meets her, he runs into a man. And the man, again, now uses those pictures against him and says, but if you get in the back of my car and do what I tell you, I won't. And the same cycle happens. And now with the young men who report far less than women, far less. I don't even have the statistic, but I bet you it's 95% less than women. Because now the fear of not only being trafficked, being raped, being horrifically victimized, but being labeled as a homosexual, all of a sudden compounds it. And they'll use that against them. They'll tell them, they'll say, they'll call them a queer, they'll call them homosexual, they'll use derogatory terms on them to purposely shame them into compliance. And those tools, they're very, very good at this. And those tools are very savvy. And you break these young adolescents who have no self-confidence down to the point that they have nothing left and they feel worthless. So they comply with being trafficked. They comply with being a sex slave. And a lot of times, I think that's an important thing to understand, because I think as a society, we see somebody being trafficked and we say, why won't they just run away?
Right.
Well, this didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen overnight. They were broken down.
This is psychological component as well.
Oh, totally. They break these people. They break their spirit. They break their will, sometimes even their will to live. They just don't even care. And then they inhibit them with drugs. Most of the victims that I've dealt with had a pretty serious drug addiction. They were, sometimes they start off as recreational users and they think it's fun because they're young and they're, into that. And then other times they're forced it. I mean, they're flat out held down and the drugs are forced into their body. So that's how kind of it starts.
And that's something where you and I have had conversations before today about that, why victims don't leave, and we've touched on that, some of the psychological components as well. For some, it seems too that weighing the situations. So while it might be bad here, maybe it would be worse in a different scenario.
Absolutely. So a lot of these victims, let's take for example the 10-year-old girl I told you who her own mother was selling her for sex. She was being sexually molested at home. So what was the, you could see really quickly how her norm was being sexually molested. So after a while, whether it's being sexually molested by a stranger or being sexually molested by her own parent, that's what they grow up to understand. And so we always got to be careful not to be quick to judge these victims, because the simple fact is they've often been put in a bad situation. We talked about the term prostitution, and I think that's an important thing, because a lot of people say things like prostitution, it's the oldest profession in the world, and we hear conversations, and I hate that. I hate that. Are there prostitutes out there? That is a person who engages in sex with other people willingly for money. Okay, yes, there are. I'm not going to say they're not. Is it the majority of the people engaged in the sex trade? No, it's not. most people use force, fraud, or coercion. I mean, let's break it down. Everybody knows about the way women and men think about sex, and men think about sex a lot more than women. And for the ladies watching the show, you'll understand this right away, is that women don't want to have sex with 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 different strangers a day. And it's violent, and it's brutal, and it's horrific. That's not, I mean, I know there's probably not a lady watching this. It's like, that sounds like a good day to me.
Right.
But that's the reality of what they're really doing. You know, so when we talk about a prostitute versus a sex slave, they are different, and we need to and be careful as a society not to call a sex trafficking victim, a sex slavery victim, a prostitute. That is a very, very horrible re-victimization of that individual. And that's something that we, as a society, we need to be really, really cautious about. So, yeah, there's many reasons why they won't come forward, but a lot of it just has to do with that conditioning.
Now, we've talked a lot about children. Of course, there are adults in this as well. Are there differences in how adult victims might be coerced into sex trafficking, human trafficking?
Yes and no. Usually, an adult will likely be brought, basically coerced into the sex trade by what we call probably a Romeo pimp, and that is a sex trafficker who showers them with gifts, showers them with presents, convinces them that they're a boyfriend and girlfriend, they are in an intimate sexual consensual relationship, and at some point he basically will compromise her some way, somehow. He'll either use drugs to inhibit her, or he'll talk her into it. He'll just simply talk her into it. And you got to remember that even whether it's a child or an adult, they're predators. They know what to look for. Let's just talk about standard sexual molestation of people, for example. We all know that real predators know which people to pick as their victims. Well, sex traffickers have the same radar for this, and so they'll pick an adult and they'll do that. Sometimes they'll do it by force with an adult. They'll force them into it, and then they'll shame them and humiliate them and break them down to the point that they don't feel like they have a choice. But most of the time, they do it by pretending they're, in an intimate relationship and, compromise them that way. But oftentimes it's with the pictures and everything else, and they use the same tactic.
So as we're talking, a lot of manipulation, taking advantage of people by whether it's charm of some kind and then eventually coercion. How can we take steps? We don't want to live in fear or live scared all the time, but what are practical things that we can do, either as me as an adult without children, to protect myself, or what can parents look out for their kids?
So let's address the adult one first, because that's the order you kind of brought up to me. So let's talk about that. As an adult, be careful about the relationships you're in. I know that the internet is all the rage and people are into internet dating and all that stuff, but there's a lot to be said for good old-fashioned relationships. Meeting people that you meet, whether they're a coworker or through a friend, going on group dating, double dates, things like that, so that there's some safety in numbers, so you can get to know somebody in a more comfortable setting. I think those are really good steps to start. Be really careful about the internet and meeting people on the internet and dating, because this is one of the main avenues these predators use. So I think that's a big cautionary thing. But however, I know that is a big trend right now. Make sure you're meeting these people when you do meet them on the internet, if that's the choice you take. Make sure you meet them in a public place, somewhere where a lot of people can see you. Maybe bring a friend. Get to know them for a while. Don't put yourself in an alone setting with any stranger until you've kind of established who they are and what they're about. Nothing's 100% safe. I know that, but take some steps to protect yourself and be smart about it. And then, obviously, I'm not judging anybody out there to say what your sexuality is or your type is or anything like that. But I'd be really careful about having people take pictures of you in compromising ways, whether it be, you know, with no clothes on or during a sex act, especially if you don't know the person very well, because it likely could be used against you. As we relate it to children, there's a lot more you can do to protect your children. First of all, and I say this with all sincerity, children do not need smartphones. They do not need a phone with every app that you can imagine, and the internet, and a camera, and a 4K TV and video capability. They don't need that. You know, if you're worried about your child, there's plenty of flip phones and GPS devices so you can track them, and they can make phone calls. And, you know, hey, T9, remember T9 texting? It still works. I asked my 13-year-old son. He still T9s. But, you know, this technology is, these predators know about it. And they know that this is the kid's language, and they speak it. And they speak it so much better. And the other thing that parents don't understand is if you think you're catching up to your child and their technology, you're not. You're a mile away. They're so far ahead of you, it's ridiculous. So if you're going to allow them to have these devices, tablets, phones, whatever, do not allow them to have them in their room at night. When they go to bed at night, the devices need to be secured in your room or the parent's room, away from the child. One of the most dangerous times for a child is them alone for several hours in their room on a device. It's a critical time. There's a story out of Utah of a young girl, and that's exactly how she became trafficked. She got compromised on the internet, just like we talked about, and every night she'd sneak out and she'd have sex with, she was 11, she'd have sex with men all night. She'd sneak in the morning, go to school, carry on with her life, and it wasn't until months later her parents figured out because she was so tired, malnourished, and struggling so bad. So this is a real thing. They don't need all this technology. They don't need all these devices. And if you're gonna allow it, dedicate the time. Do you remember when the internet first kind of came out? We'd always say, have the computer in a public space so everyone can see it. Right. But how do you do that with a phone now? Right. Talk to your kids about trafficking. Talk to your kids about being manipulated. Tell them, I have blunt conversations with my daughter about it. Don't be manipulated. Don't be, don't put yourself in a compromising position. It's very important.
And in our final couple minutes here, there's also trainings that are happening. You're helping with that across North Central Montana, all across the state, for medical professionals, for people who work in hotels. Let's just talk briefly about those, the trainings that are happening.
Absolutely. The Northwest Human Trafficking Task Force does a great job with this type of stuff. I actually end up doing quite a few of the trainings. I enjoy doing them. It's a good thing to get out in the community and see people. Yeah, but we've been doing training for medical personnel, hotels, different big, huge community events, all sorts of things, because this is a good thing for people to be aware of and to understand their specific role. Because I think that's important, because we all play a little bit different part in this fight. But I think it's important that we know our role. That's the hardest thing when you're trying to help is, how do I help? Right. And so the task force is doing a phenomenal job. They're really working hard and getting out there as we saw recently.
And there are community efforts as well recently in Great Falls, and I know other places across the state, the spreading of red sand in cracks along sidewalks and businesses, just to help bring that awareness, bring more recognition. It seems like there is being more attention, more recognition of it lately as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
Got to keep it in the forefront of our minds. And of course, there are plenty more resources that people can go online and find. We've only really scratched the surface even of talking about this. Are there resources that you know of off the top of your head that you could let people know about?
Some of the so there's some private organizations out there. I can't think of all of them off the top of my head, but Operation Underground Railroad, Deliver Fund. There's a whole bunch that they're like nationwide, and they have tons of resources. They have videos. They have just there's this show called I Am Jane Doe, which is really popular. I think it's on the internet now. You can watch it. That type of stuff is great. It's great information for people. I think the bottom line, though, the most important thing is don't be in denial. Don't be in denial that this isn't happening in your community, because it is. That's the first step.
All right, Sheriff Slaughter, we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks so much for joining us, giving us your insight into this tough topic.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And thank you for joining us here for this edition of Face the State.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.
At the base